Hello, listeners, and welcome to another episode of Fighting Failure. This is the third episode, I believe, of our conservation section, all about marine conservation and oceanic ecosystems. I'm your host, Sandhya Stapleton.
Yep, and I am her co-host for this episode, Hisham Kanan. Unfortunately, Oscar could not make it for this episode as of now. He might join later in the meet.
And I'm Hisha's cousin, Emily.
Yep, and she'll be joining us for this episode as a guest.
It's very nice to have her here. So in the first episode, we talked about wildlife conservation, mostly on land, but today we're going to be focusing on the bodies of water on our Earth. We also do have plans for an ocean section later. We're going to focus on conservation here. We can jump straight in with the problems, because there are quite a lot that our oceanic ecosystems are facing. Starting with overfishing and bycatch. Millions of people rely on fishing as a source of protein, and it is essentially the principal source of income for many people around the world. And when fish start to disappear like they are now, thousands of people can lose their jobs. All of this stems from overfishing, which is where, in a race to gather stocks and supplies and food for stores and businesses and families, people tend to focus on fishing in certain areas that were previously successful for them. And as the fish population in the area starts to die out, the fish's reproduction rate slows down, and there are less and less fish in the area for fishers to catch.
You know what? It's funny because that actually just made me think of Moana, because wasn't it in the beginning of the movie they overfished in that one area, and then she wanted to go beyond the reef to fish, and there was that whole, and then she ended up going beyond the reef to save their island or something like that. And overfishing greatly impacts the food web and our ecosystems. And so, as there are many marine species such as sharks and larger fish, depending on fish for food, when the fish start to disappear, entire ecosystems can crumble, resulting in the losses of important and even endangered marine species like sea turtles. So it's the same, on land. When you take out one animal or one aspect which other animals rely on, then those animals begin to dwindle because they don't have that supply which they need. And so mass amounts of fishing also spells trouble for other marine life that have the misfortune to get caught. As we talked about briefly in the last episode, fishers will often kill creatures like dolphins and sharks if they catch them instead of letting them go. As a result, sea life has become unstable, despite only making up 4% of the endangered creatures list. Also, a lot of these animals die prior to them actually being hauled on board because they get caught up in the nets, and the nets cut into their skin, and then they die from blood loss and such.
Yeah, and the fact about 4% of the endangered creatures list. You have the endangered creatures list is the animals that are their numbers are so low that they're in danger of extinction, right? What we're potentially not accounting for are the species that are being mass fished, and then their numbers are dwindling, not enough to be on the endangered creatures list, but enough to be in danger of.
You won't be able to, it's basically that it's harder to find these species. If you go out, the wolf used to be endangered, right? And so the whole idea with them being endangered was that they're on the brink of extinction. So if you go out into the wild, into the west of the US, into the north, you'll find less of those wolves, and it'll be significantly harder for you to find them than it is, once if they're not on that list.
Something that is also important to take into account is that some of those species like sharks that can get caught in bycatch, or that are sometimes being caught for food, a lot of those species are considered signals of ecosystem health, because their role in an ecosystem is so important that putting them out of balance is going to throw whole ecosystems of fish out of balance, and then that becomes far less sustainable. So then even if we are not necessarily directly interfering with that portion, it's still a further along effect of overfishing for certain species.
I think the technical term, I'm not sure, it's called a keystone species, right?
All right. And so our next point here was plastic pollution. And so everyone knows about plastic pollution, or I assume that everyone knows about plastic pollution. But plastic pollution, so landfill spilling out into the water, people maybe boating and throwing out plastics into the water, whatever the case is, plastic always ends up in the ocean. Maybe it's in a landfill, gets swept into a river, which feeds into a lake, which feeds into another river, into the ocean. There's so many ways for it to happen, but plastics will almost always end up in the ocean. And so it congregates, it builds up, and then animals die from, of course, eating or getting trapped in the plastic. So I've seen tons of pictures, and I've also seen lots of videos from documentaries of, penguins with those, what are those things, the things that bind the bottles together, those plastic things with those holes in them, and the penguins get them stuck on their necks and stuff. And actually this brings to mind another animated movie, Happy Feet, where there's that one penguin who has like the thing around his neck in the first movie. And so there's a lot of unfortunate cases like that. Sea turtles eating plastics. I've seen sea turtles, when I was scuba diving, I've seen sea turtles eating, it actually, for a second I thought that a sea turtle was eating plastic, and I realized it was like kelp or something. But so I had a scare for a second, but that it's hard to differentiate stuff like that. And so you do get certain animals intaking plastics, thinking that it's some sort of food, right? And so that's also a problem, because that can clog their digestive systems, I think, because it's very hard to break down. And there's also a lot of toxins involved in plastics, right?
Plastic in the ocean, to give you an idea of how much plastic actually gets into the ocean, there are garbage patches in the middle of like the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans where the garbage patch, like just kind of all the garbage comes together and creates like an island, like almost the size of Texas, an island of garbage.
Yeah, and I think that's just because you get all this, the tides, and it sweeps it out, and then where the tides meet, then you get all this plastic just being swept into the area. And that's not all, those islands are not entirely built up of solid plastics. Some of that is microplastics, and we'll talk about that in a minute or two. But yeah, so it's there's lots of issues with that.
And just to bring the plastic thing to scale, again, because it's a massive problem, the animals, just to highlight the number of animals affected by this plastic problem, like plastic is the cause of harm to over 800 marine species. It even affects seabirds, which are the birds that kind of dive into the waves to get fish and often end up like suffocating and choking on plastic and marine debris.
Oh, and there's another statistic that I've seen, that if we weren't able to do anything about plastic, or if we weren't taking steps, that there could be more plastic than fish in the ocean by 2050 at the rate that we are going. So that's why it's so important to start working on slowing the rate and then removing plastic when we can.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. And then I think it's, I think this also comes into microplastics, but you do have certain fish intaking plastics and microplastics. And then not only does that affect seabirds who intake those fish, so this is also a huge problem for humans. So not only is this a problem for certain seabirds who will intake these plastics via the fish, so that includes microplastics and solid plastics, but humans, and I don't know the exact statistics, but humans do intake plastics via fish. So, and you can imagine all the problems that'll create in our digestive systems. And there's in certain types of plastic, there are large quantities of toxins. And so then that can be chemically dangerous for our systems. And so this is a huge problem, not only for sea life, but for humans as well, and humans whom intake fish.
And speaking of microplastics, I know you were talking about that a little bit earlier. So everyone knows that, or a lot of people know that plastic takes hundreds of years to decompose. But even after it degrades and it's broken down, particles and pieces of the plastic still remain. So microplastics, a quick definition. Microplastics are small pieces of plastic debris that are less than 5 millimeters in length, extremely difficult to clean up, and are small enough to be easily ingested by small fish and other marine life. That kind of marine life will go on to die from the strain on their digestive systems or get caught by fishing companies, like Hisha said, and eventually make their way into our food, causing like stomach issues and diseases, and I think there was something about cancer. I'm not sure if I read it correctly.
Yeah, because of those toxins, microplastics can be the cause of certain cancers in humans. And that's, I think, oftentimes due to the intake of fish which contain microplastics in their systems.
Well, it's something about microplastics that makes them so hard for us to really clean up or even understand how many of them there are in the ocean is they can very easily get lost due to a process called biofouling, which is essentially algae, which grows in the ocean, can attach to the plastic particles, and that added density can make them sink below the surface because they're no longer positively buoyant. They're going to be more neutral and start sinking down. And once they start sinking down, it's going to be nearly impossible for us to find them, which is part of like why they're so hard to track and like really clean up.
I did not know that, actually. That's really interesting.
That is interesting, and I'm sure that we should add that to our section on algae blooms, because I'm sure that is just one more problem with algae blooms.
Yeah, algae blooms is actually part of chemical pollution, which is our next point. So our next point is chemical pollution, which is where all the harmful chemicals that humans have made that have like dug us into a deeper hole. I know we touched on a lot of them in Haitia's section on agriculture, like chemical pesticides, herbicides, fertilizers, and things like oil and industrial chemicals and sewage. And those chemicals, though they may start upstream and inland, they're gonna eventually make their way into local streams and end up in lakes and that feed into larger streams that feed into the ocean, like Keisha said before. And those chemical poisons those chemicals will poison the water and create algae blooms, like we were talking about. And those algae blooms essentially suck the oxygen out of the water around them and create dead zones where very few marine organisms can live. And like Emily pointed out, they can make it really hard to track microplastics if they are grown around them.
Something else with the dead zones is not just is the algae like taking in a lot of the oxygen, but because it's covering the surface, plants further down aren't able to get the light they need to photosynthesize and create more oxygen, which is sort of like how it becomes a looping cycle.
And then surely that becomes problems for animals which rely on those the marine plant life to live, right? I wanted to point out that this did come into the fertilizer section of my agriculture section, because oftentimes unnatural fertilizers will have certain chemicals in them, and these chemicals, when swept off fields, can cause certain types of algae blooms. And there's actually a perfect example which I have, which is currently happening in Vermont. It happens almost year round. And although Vermont is fairly good at sustainable agriculture, we do use a lot of manure, which is a natural fertilizer, and we do use certain places use unnatural chemical fertilizers, and these fertilizers do get swept away into Lake Champlain, which is the lake between Vermont, Montreal, and New York. And right now in the lake there's blue and green algae blooms, and it's because of these fertilizers. So actually the other day there was this advertisement that popped up on my iPad and said it was trying to convince people to reduce their usage of certain fertilizers so that there's a reduction in algae blooms in the lake due to chemicals found in fertilizers.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It doesn't only affect the oceans, guys. It's all bodies of water. And
yeah, I think that's important, because I think oftentimes when people think marine, they think of solely the ocean. And I think that, overlooking lakes and rivers. Rivers are hugely important to certain ecosystems, to all ecosystems, in fact, and to overlook rivers and lakes, I think, is a huge mistake.
Definitely. Also, just one more point in the chemical pollution section area, I guess. Those chemicals that are being dumped into the lakes and rivers and oceans are going to end up infecting fish. Like it's an add-on to the point with microplastics before. The chemicals are going to infect fish and make it back into the fishing industry, and we're essentially indirectly poisoning ourselves.
Yeah, I think it's crazy because fish are generally considered to be like a healthy meat, I suppose. And so because, fish contain tons of protein, and fish oils are super healthy, and they contain low amounts of fat content. And so they're considered to be like superfood, certain fish.
They're like the opposite of the meat industry.
And then what's happening now is that we're poisoning these fish, and we're going to end up poisoning ourselves. And so, fish are going to go from like this health food to an actually dangerous intake.
Well, like beyond just the chemicals that are like affecting the fish, a lot of algae blooms, just because of the chemicals and because of like the nature of how they grow, the algae itself can become toxic, and then that within itself is another problem because it can cause a lot of sickness or even cause death in a lot of fish and other creatures, but that could also affect humans if we were to intake some of it. Like I know certain toxins from algae can even cause like neurological and like brain issues within certain species that like impacts their way of life and how they're able to thrive.
Yeah, that is very interesting. And I was wondering if either of you guys know, I'm not sure if this is correct, but is it possible for global warming and warming temperatures to increase the likeliness of algae blooms? I thought I heard something about that once or twice, but I'm just not sure. And I don't want to be feeding out false misinformation. But, that would just be one more issue, right? Global warming, there's already so many problems with it. And then increased algae blooms, and then, all the problems with the acidity in the water and chemical.
Warmer temperatures prevent water from mixing, allowing algae to grow thicker and faster. Warmer water is easier for small organisms to move through and allows algae to float to the surface faster. Algal blooms absorb sunlight, making water even warmer and promoting more blooms.
I'm glad that I attempted to highlight that, because I guess that is very important, because I think that's something which is definitely overlooked. An overlooked side effect of global warming is that increased algae blooms, and then that'll be dangerous for humans and for our marine ecosystems. And so that's just one more problem. It's not just going to be, so it's not only that we'll be harming our land ecosystems, we'll also be harming our marine ecosystems.
Oh, one more thing. I don't know if I wrote it down. I think I may have forgotten about it earlier. Swimming, because it's like a whole large part of the like modern society. Like he's just a swimmer. So when we're polluting these waters and poisoning the water and dumping chemicals in there, don't we want to swim in that? Are we really gonna like destroy our like water sources?
It defeats the recreational side of things as well.
Just motivation for you guys. You need to put a stop to this so you can keep swimming on top of all the other problems.
Due to like an increased demand in minerals and metals, has turned a lot of attention to looking for those resources under the seafloor or the bottoms of lakes. And this process causes a lot of detriment for the environment, a lot of pollution and destruction to the seafloor, which can harm and even destroy entire marine ecosystems. And disturbing the sediment from the floor sends up these plumes of sediment that can smother sea life and harm whales, which filter feed, and other species that filter feed like that. And many species rely on vegetation on the seafloor, so destroying that vegetation through the mining process would also be problematic and another side effect of looking for these resources in the ocean.
Yeah. I had never actually heard of this
You had
issue until today.
no Hisho.
What?
Year 6, the debate was about mining for oil in Lake Malawi.
Oh, yeah, okay, I remember that now. I can't remember that far back, Sandhya. That's a little bit hard. But yes. But I hadn't really heard of this until now, which I'm surprised about because I do hear about kind of the detrimental effects of mining on land, but again, we've kind of overlooked the detriment which we're doing by mining for oil and for minerals and resources in the ocean and in our lakes and rivers.
Yeah, for sure.
Even just not directly the mining itself, but like having the rigs and the different things out there that people need to live on can lead to a lot of dumping of other things into the ocean, like sewage and chemicals that they need to use that they then have leftovers of, may end up also impacting the ocean just as a side effect from mining.
Yeah. We were talking about the debate, and apparently my memory is much better than Hisha's because I remember this one point about how when you're mining for those things, how are you going to guarantee that the minerals, and especially when you're mining for oil, how are you going to guarantee that the oil that you're mining for is not going to leak out while you're mining and infect and poison the marine area around it?
I think that's another great point because oil pollution does have a huge effect on all species, and I've seen a lot of saddening pictures, disturbing pictures of seabirds and the penguins, I suppose, are seabirds who've been, caught up in oil spills, and it smothers them, and they can't. It makes it hard for them to swim, to dive. They can't fly if they're flying birds, I guess, because penguins don't fly. And it's really sad to see. And oil is not safe to intake. Just the same as it's just the same as it is for humans. It's not safe for seabirds and sea life to intake oil. So that's also, that can be a cause of poisoning for a certain marine life.
Moving on to the next point, which is ocean acidification. I can put my biology to use. So many sea creatures depend on the specific pH of the ocean to live. So you have a specific acidity of the ocean. I think it's the average around 8.1 or something. But the recent increase in carbon dioxide in the air makes oceans more acidic and affects marine calcifiers like corals and mollusks. I have some diagrams here. Essentially, the carbon dioxide, it dissolves into the water and increases the carbon in the water. Yeah, so the acidity of the oceans increases, and calcifiers that require like a specific balance of acidity to create their shells and their shells essentially are affected, and their shells will become like weaker and smaller, and that in turn affects other creatures that may depend on those animals or life forms to live.
Well, and then like you mentioned coral, between like not just the acidity of the ocean, but that's one factor that contributes to it, but also like heat and everything else. Coral bleaching is becoming more widely seen as a common issue in coral reefs, which is essentially that coral relies on it's a symbiotic relationship, so the algae that lives on the coral is what gives it its color and what provides it its life. But with the increased acidity and the warmer water, that makes it so that the algae can no longer live on the coral, and it essentially is what's killing the coral, and which is why it's called bleaching, because the seabed sort of just looks white because all the color is gone from the coral.
Yeah, I mean, like coral reefs are considered like one of the most beautiful landscapes essentially in the world, or scapes, yeah, not exactly on land. Everyone's talking about how, on land, all of these beautiful natural landscapes are being destroyed by global warming, but also underwater, you're getting essentially coral bleaching, like you said, Emily, and those scapes are being destroyed as well.
Yeah, oceanscapes, I suppose. And I have another story here. So I've gone scuba diving a couple of times. I have a certification, and I was diving in Mozambique near Vilanculos. And so my parents don't dive, so I was kind of there on my own with a dive group, with a group of other guys. But we went out on this boat, right? And we're going over these huge waves, which is kind of unimportant to the story, but I like to tell it like this, and just kind of plummeting down. And we get to the place, right? And so we all get out of the boat and kind of descend. And at the bottom, there was literally no color. There was some coral, and the coral was all basically white, and then you had rocks, and there was algae floating everywhere. So it was really hard to see, even like a couple meters in front of you. I did see tons of cool stuff, I have to say. Like, I did see a reef shark. I saw a couple, I saw a hawksbill turtle and a couple green turtles, and I saw a huge stingray, which I almost stepped on by accident. But, it's horrible to see these scapes go because of human activity. And so, yeah, I think that's a huge problem, and it was really sad to see in contrast to like my experience in Zanzibar, where I had seen these kind of super bright, super colorful corals.
I didn't even been to Zanzibar. I've been to Zanzibar too.
Yeah.
When I was much younger.
So here's a topic which I do not know much about, but I will do my best to highlight it. So underwater noise. So noise and light pollution is a huge disruption to marine ecosystems. And there's a reason why we're told not to tap on the fish tanks. So if you've been to like an aquarium and you see like the little kids banging on the fish tanks, that's not acceptable at all. But many marine species use sound to communicate, and when we flood their habitats with artificial noise and light pollution, we disrupt their natural behaviors and influence entire ecosystems and fishing communities. And I actually know a little bit more about this than I think I did before. Yes, light pollution. I've seen this. I've seen a video. I think it was like Planet Earth 2, one of the episodes, narrated by David Attenborough, my favorite environmental narrator from the like environmental docuseries. But anyway, so in big cities, right, there's lots of lights in all the windows, and even from space you can see the lights in big cities. And so you have these crazy lights everywhere, car lights, you have lights in the windows, like I said, you have those crazy ones outside of shops and everything. There's light absolutely everywhere. And the turtles, once they hatch, they hatch at night. So the way that they find the ocean is they basically dig themselves out of the sand, and they see the glint of the moonlight on the surface of the water, and that's where they kind of crawl to so that they can get into the ocean. But what was happening was that these baby sea turtles were actually crawling towards roads and towards buildings. And what the problem is here is that, they're not going to make it to the water. And so you get these sea turtles, baby sea turtles, being run over by cars. You get them falling into drainage ditches, and you get them, maybe if they survive today, which is not likely, they're going to be taken by seabirds and eaten. So then you have this reduction in the number of these baby sea turtles, which are actually surviving the hatching process, and that's because of light pollution in big cities.
Also, in noise pollution, you get, like, again, with the mining companies, the drilling and that kind of thing, there's loud noise, and these fish that require, like, echolocation, or, like, I know dolphins do echolocation, I think, or the vibrations through the water.
Yeah, like dolphins and maybe whales, and yeah.
Yeah, the creatures that rely on like vibrations and echolocation and that kind of thing to communicate and like live, essentially, they're getting like confused by the noise. Kind of like the baby sea turtles are being confused by the light.
Like another issue with the sound, like even not just with the mining, is like sonar and just vessels which use sound as a way to track things is still disruptive and still like especially interruptive for like whales and things which use echolocation to hunt, because sound is not just going to affect the area immediately around the ship, because sound travels exceptionally well in water, just given the nature of the waves being able to travel really well without as much to prevent the sound from continuing to travel. So it can be like thousands and thousands of feet away and you can still hear that sound, which is why it's so pervasive for certain species.
One more problem, which, is kind of built into that chemical section which we did, but, boating can be a huge problem because the boats are, they're putting out the fumes, and so, that's problem number one, of course. But then you have sometimes boats will leak oil, and if there's any oil on the hull or anything, that oil can be spread via boats, and the outputs which they put out, because it's outputs, are also, can be dangerous. And so you get this kind of spread of oil via boats, and boats are, I think it's fun. Some people don't enjoy boats, but boats can be, fun to ride on. Of course, there's lots of boating activities, and it's great. And it's also a great way to enjoy our systems. And, it's how we travel out into the ocean oftentimes to get to like a diving location. But I think that it's also overlooked that boats are a huge problem for these marine ecosystems. And I think it's like the same thing, of course, it's the same problems that we mentioned earlier about oil leaks when mining and that sort of thing with these boats, with the outputs of these boats.
And even beyond that, just in terms of emissions, like I believe the statistic I have here is that shipping and a lot of like the large vessels that will be traveling around to deliver like our products and be continuing like the consumer line, they contribute to 3% of all global CO2, carbon dioxide, that is contributing to climate change. But there are ways to combat that, like even just like slowing the ship down and having it travel a little bit slower can reduce the CO2 by like 27%. So it's not necessarily something that we can't do anything about. It's something that we can do a lot about, especially like transitioning to new fuel sources. But it is an issue of shipping being a large source of emissions as well.
That's a fantastic point. And I think I may have mentioned this in the, global supply chains episode. And I'm so happy, I forgot about that, but I'm so happy that you brought it up, because it is a huge problem. And it's just this cycle, which I think a lot of middle class and well-off communities have gotten into, is just this like excessive buying, excessive shopping, online shopping, and, shipping things from one place to another. And this, I think people think about this a lot when they, about in terms of like planes and cars, but I think it's actually overlooked with boats, and kind of our supply chains. And so I also, another way to reduce that, I think, is like the reduction of demand which you're putting out. So if you can get stuff locally, shop local, #shop local, if you can get something local, get it local instead of buying online. Like, we've known people in Malawi who've preferred to like order their food via Amazon rather than going to the store and buying a fresh meat and fresh veg. And so, I mean, stuff like that can definitely be cut down on, and that definitely has to be taken into account.
I think we're going to move on to solutions. And I do know that there's probably things I missed in this part that you guys will know more about, which is why we do this as a group, so that everyone can put in their input.
I think that you did a great job, Sandhya. I think you did a great job putting in stuff. There was some stuff in there which I had no idea about. Like, I never would have put stuff.
So we're going to start with helping to advocate for marine protected areas. So I talked about national parks in our first episode. Just like very much like national parks, we can help support and protect marine ecosystems by creating protected areas that are essentially free of waste and major human intervention. National parks, like we said in a previous episode, are areas where humans go for recreational activity, but they're also safe havens for animals and ecosystems. And we can do that with the oceans and lakes as well.
Yeah, I think in Lake Malawi, so where kind of me and Sandhya and Oscar met, and where I lived during most of the year, Lake Malawi. So there's these huge numbers of cichlids. I think there's some like ridiculous, like 70% of like the world's like fish tank, freshwater fish, that type of fish come from Malawi, these Malawi cichlids. And there's all types of them. And so in an attempt to protect the fish from overfishing, which is a huge problem in Malawi, they've created these protected areas. So around certain islands, you're not allowed to fish. It's punishable by law. And so I think that was really great to see, especially in like a developing nation like Malawi, to see that, that's being taken into account, and that's a possibility for the government to do was just fantastic. And so, yeah, definitely I agree with that. The idea of protecting areas, and again, like national parks, not only are they recreational, but they also provide insight into how our ecosystems work. So similarly to zoos, which is one of the kind of, I think, limited benefits of zoos, is that, zoos and national parks provide places where humans can go experience an intimate kind of connection with nature, and they can kind of gain this understanding of how our ecosystems work, so they get this kind of intimacy between them and the animals, which they're kind of learning about, then promotes kind of their assistance in the conservation efforts to protect these animals. And so kind of creating that site for that intimacy between humans and nature is fantastic as well for promoting conservation.
Similarly, from a research perspective, having protected areas to observe is really useful, because then scientists can see which species are like rebounding and coming back, and how the different interactions in ecosystems would sort of, whether or not they'd be able to correct themselves if they were left alone and given the space to recover. And as Hisho said, it's a really like good safe haven. Species that are dealing with a lot of overfishing or predation outside of these protected areas can come to these protected areas where there is no fishing and no taking of species, as kind of a place to recover a little bit and help their population return.
Yeah, that's a fantastic point. And again, well, not again, I think I've maybe stated it in previous episodes, but I think it's important to understand that national parks and kind of protected areas are a fantastic solution, but we cannot only protect our animals in national parks and certain protected areas. We have to work to protect animals in unprotected areas. So in local forests where hunting is permitted, in fishing areas, even in our cities, we have to create ways where we can kind of safely integrate animals into our urban lives, and so that we are protecting them all around and not just in national parks, because it won't be enough to just protect them in protected areas.
Yeah, and there are ecosystems that are very specific that we can protect some of, but we cannot protect all of them. One that comes to mind for me is mangroves, which is where basically there are these trees that grow their roots into the seawater and the seabed near the coast, because they're adapted to survive in salt water. And we, of course, can't protect all of them, but we do know that if we protect them, it can be really helpful, because these trees can absorb a lot of toxins from the water and provide shelter to like dozens and dozens of species of fish and crustaceans and other small creatures. So it's important to keep in mind, like, yes, we can protect some of that, but of course we cannot protect all of it. With protected areas, we need to take care of that outside of the protected areas and still keep those areas in mind.
Our next point is influencing the market. And this is something which has come up so many times in our previous episodes. If you want to know more about influencing the market, go back to our global supply chains episode, our vegetarian and veganism friend or foe episode, which I know was episode 5. Go back and listen to these for more information on how to influence the market. But kind of to begin on this, 90% of seafood in the USA is imported. To try and eat food from local sources is of great help. So we started this hashtag because it's just, so common and so important. Hashtag keep things local. If you have social media, which I don't, but if you do, go ahead and post hashtag keep things local whenever you buy food locally, to promote the whole idea of getting things from local sources, because humans are so fixated on getting things that are exotic, getting things from other places. And I think often we lose focus on the fact that we can get things from local sources and sustainable sources. And also these numerous sources that are completely within our grasp. And so, I mean, again, like there was that thing which I said about we know people in Malawi who've bought all their food from like Amazon, and I there's like all these stores in Malawi. Like there's this store called Kapani where we go get meat and stuff like that, and they have fresh meat, sustainable meat, and they have fresh veg, and wherever you go to get your food. Yeah, we even have farmers. We have farmers markets basically everywhere. I mean, I was surprised that we have farmers markets in Malawi, but they're huge in Vermont, especially. We have farmers markets like every day of the week. There's farmers markets. And so there's all these ways that you can get stuff locally. And we should not be overlooking these, because what happens is by getting stuff which has to be imported, you increase the demand for imported food and for imported goods. And in increasing the demand for imported goods, the suppliers are going to want to up their supply. They're going to want to increase their supply to match the demand. And as they do that, they're going to have to continue fishing. It might turn into overfishing, but then they're going to have to buy more ships to ship it to different places. And we talked about the problems with that. And they're going to have to maybe ship it, but maybe by plane. But, there's also problems with that, whether it's truck, plane, ship, it's going to have to get to where you are somehow, right? And there's problems with each of those methods. And so then it's this whole global supply chain, which you're kind of boosting. And what we want to be doing instead is reducing that and kind of trying to keep things local.
Yeah, so our final point is to do your part in climate action, since a lot of problems that affect the ocean just come from the general climate problems that are affecting all parts of the planet, like plastic pollution and carbon emissions. So you can really do your part to prevent ocean acidification and marine pollution. Even if you don't live near the coast, there's a lot of really easy steps you can take, like reducing how much plastic you use, don't take straws, try and bring reusable bags to places if you're going to get things. And then for like carbon emissions, like driving less, making more conscious decisions of like what you're using to get from place to place. So there's a lot of steps that you can take at home that will impact the oceans, even if you don't live even anywhere near them.
Yeah, there's just so many things. I mean, for kids who go to school and take packaged goods, maybe reducing the number of packaged goods or increasing the sustainable, increasing kind of your intake of goods which come in sustainably packaged goods. And so there's just so many ways that you can take part in kind of reducing the effects of climate change everywhere and pollution everywhere. Again, getting a hybrid car, getting an electric car, whatever is feasible for you. Again, that the influence of the market, keeping things local. There's just so many ways to help the environment.
Oh, hi, Oscar.
Hello. I just come back from D.A.V., so well done starting without me. That was a good decision. Yeah, so apparently the UK thinks an area of outstanding natural beauty is just a really big field where posh people ride horses. That's what I've taken away from this experience. Also, stir your pasta, otherwise it will burn on the bottom of the pan.
Ah, very interesting. I will keep that in mind.
So, take care of your trash correctly. So, reduce the amount of plastic and other waste you're throwing out. So, obviously, first step of this is to go one step backwards and to try and buy stuff that just doesn't have as much plastic stuff, doesn't come in plastic packaging. So whenever we order online from Tesco, which is a British supermarket chain, we always ask for them to put it not in a bag and give it fresh and that sort of stuff. Also, just if you're buying in a shop, then don't get a bag, bring your own bag. It's pretty standard stuff these days. And try to reuse and recycle as much as you can. So one thing that we do, for example, is we get this sort of food box delivery. It comes in a box, and then my little brother is like turning the box into a toy car. It's just stuff like that, which is a bit fun. Annoying thing is the sort of crinkly plastic that a lot of stuff comes in? That's not really useful for anything because it rips really easily. And that's also not usually recyclable. But you've got to be really careful with your recycling and sort your recycling properly. Not all types of plastic are recyclable, but some are. Check which one is which, because if you put non-recyclable plastic into the recycling, then they will throw the entire bin out, potentially even the entire truck of recycling will just get put to landfill because of the contamination. So you've got to be really careful about it, because you might think it doesn't matter, but you could actually have a really bad impact. So you've got to be very careful about that.
You know, Oscar, I've got to hail Vermont on this, because in Vermont, they actually go through the trash and they go through the recycling and they filter it for you. And so we still sort it out ourselves as best we can. But in any case, in Vermont, because Vermont's awesome, they go through it for everyone to make sure that they are putting things into recycling and that they're reducing the amount of waste, which is going to go into landfills and eventually maybe end up in the ocean.
You're lucky. Your home country is somewhere you can be proud of. Australia's climate record is terrible.
Yes, I know. It's my home state. Oscar, I have to say, it's my home state. It's not my home...
True. My home state is Queensland. I lived there for a few years. I can't even remember it. Apparently it's boiling hot, and that's all I know about it. Australia as a whole is terrible climate-wise. It's some of the highest per capita emissions. It's kind of terrible, and oh gosh, yeah, honestly. Anyway, so see if you can find out where the waste is going. So I know for example, I live in Oxford, and I know that non-recyclable waste goes to Ardley in Oxfordshire, where it is burnt to produce electricity, and the emissions are carbon captured and used in the aggregate. So, and then in fact, our county council, I can be proud of at least where I live. So our county council provides leaflets based on where all our rubbish is going, so we can see. I think compared to the rest of the UK, there's not much of the sort of rubbish exporting stuff that's going on, which is not very good. And the last thing here is do whatever you can to make sure any waste you have goes somewhere you can dispose of properly. So that's where we talked about before. Don't litter. When I was on DV, we were sort of near the back of the different groups, and I picked up 5 different pieces of litter that were clearly from people in our group or in our sort of year group, and I was very sad to see that they were just dropping Oreo packets and stuff in this, I'm doing air quotes here, area of outside natural beauty. It's still nice. It doesn't need littering, there are enough bins around, and do sort your recycling, because you don't want to have your entire bin contaminated.
And I have just one more example of kind of reducing your waste, and it's very specific, it's very boiled down, and this is 100% one of my pet peeves. I go crazy. But when you get packaging, which is done in bubble wrapping and stuff, you do not have to pop the bubbles. Once you pop the bubbles, you have to throw it out. But if you just remove that and store it, you can reuse it for packaging later on instead of just having to throw it out. And so it's just a pet peeve of mine, which I had to put in here, because my sister always, when we get packages in the US, because it's not really easy to get packages in Malawi, but when we get packages in the US, which have bubble wrapping, she always takes it out and pops it immediately, and it drives me absolutely crazy, because this bubble wrapping can be reused as packaging material again. So I think that, that's, if you do get packages often, maybe start storing your bubble wrapping instead of just throwing it out.
Yeah, that's a good point, because as I was talking about, when we get stuff in bags, the supermarket bags, the plastic bags, sometimes they're unavoidable. We always keep them, and then at a later date, so we need to carry something, we can just get one of those bags out and reuse them until they get completely torn up, and then we recycle them. So yeah, it's definitely worth. Some of the plastic, the crinkly stuff, is usually useless, but if it's not crinkly, it's A, probably recyclable, and B, probably reusable. So that's one thing the industry as a whole needs to do, is to get rid of the horrible crinkly plastic. Makes such a horrible sound as well.
And I don't think we have anything left, do we? But I wanted to congratulate my cousin Emily on her acceptance into college. Emily, do you want to tell everyone where you're going?
Yeah, I'm going to be attending the University of California in San Diego this fall to study marine biology.
Yeah, which is absolutely awesome. It's a fantastic school with a great marine biology course, and I'm super proud of her. It's awesome. So thank you so much, Emily, for coming on this episode with us.
Yeah, we're very grateful. I think we're going to wrap up the episode. Thank you again to Emily for joining us on this episode. And keep in mind that everyone can do their part. Also, Oscar, do you want to do a plug-in for our Patreon?
Great. So I've got something I really want to talk about this sort of topic, which is the documentary Seaspiracy. I watched it recently, and there's been quite a lot of controversy about it. But I don't want to sort of make these episodes really long. So if you subscribe to our Patreon, which will be a link in the description, it only costs $1 a month, the most basic tier, and you get access to exclusive episodes. And I'm going to be talking about Seaspiracy. I also want to talk about a couple of other more niche topics on there for people who support us, and that will allow us to do things such as buy microphones and do other stuff to sort of educate people about climate. And so if you could, it's as little as $12 a year, really. Like, that's just like one burger from McDonald's. I don't even know. Maybe it's a couple burgers from McDonald's, but, you know, like, it's quite cheap, and it would really help us out. And then you can also get some perks as well from supporting us. We would be so grateful. We personally give you a shout out on the show if you join as well, even if it's just the $1 tier. So please consider it, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you, and goodbye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.